In the final days of October 1887, in a Dutch settlement along the Hudson River Valley, while other families were busy stacking cordwood and sealing shutters with tar paper, Jonathan van der Meer was doing something that made no sense at all. He was building a heavy wooden cabinet, lined with wool, fitted with thick curtains that sealed shut like a tomb. His two small children would sleep inside. Neighbors laughed and called it a coffin for the living. But Jonathan knew a killing frost was coming, and he was gambling that a box of still air could defeat a night cold enough to freeze oxen solid. Jonathan van der Meer was a Dutch cabinet maker, raising two small children alone on a windswept claim in the Hudson Valley. His daughter Anna was not yet 2 years old, his son Johannes just 7. That autumn, the old-timers predicted the hardest frost in a generation. While neighbors stuffed their walls with newspaper and horsehair, Jonathan began building a sealed sleeping box, a bedstead exactly like those his grandparents had used in the Netherlands. The settlement mocked him. A man puts his children in a drawer, they said. But Jonathan knew that a pocket of still air, warmed by 3 bodies, could stay 10 degrees above the room outside. The question was, could it stay warm enough through a killing frost, or would the curtained box become a frozen tomb? And then the temperature began to fall. The Van der Meer homestead stood at the edge of a broad, flat valley the Dutch had called Klein Kill, a place the English maps left unnamed. The soil was good, but the wind had no natural break for 8 miles north of the property line. In winter, that meant the temperature could drop 40 degrees in a single afternoon. Jonathan knew this because he had already buried his wife there 3 years earlier, not from cold, but from a fever that took her while he held a wet cloth to her forehead in a house he couldn't keep warm. The stove glowed red, and still the frost crept through the chinking. He never forgot that helplessness. So when the almanac for 1887 predicted the earliest deep freeze in 30 years, he didn't reach for more firewood. He reached for a piece of Dutch history that most Americans had never heard of. The bedstead, or cupboard bed, was a fixture in rural homes across the Netherlands for centuries. Essentially, a large wooden cabinet built into the wall or standing against it, enclosed on 3 sides, with a heavy curtain or wooden doors on the fourth. It created a microclimate around the sleepers. The average adult exhales roughly a pint of water vapor and generates the heat of a 75-watt lamp overnight. Trapped inside that small space, the temperature could rise 12 to 15 degrees above the ambient room, enough to ward off hypothermia even when the house itself fell below freezing. Jonathan's own grandmother had been born in one during the harsh winter of 1814, and she'd lived to 87. So when the neighbors saw him hauling planks of kiln-dried pine into his workshop, they assumed he was building more furniture for sale at the river landing. He was not. The first person to notice something odd was Marinus Hoek, a deacon at the Reformed church who ran the livery down the road. Hoek had known Jonathan since the crossing, 2 Dutchmen who'd fled the damp of Rotterdam to find a different kind of damp in America. He stopped by one afternoon in early October and found Jonathan planning a long side panel fitted with tiny brass hinges. Inside the panel, Jonathan had tacked a layer of heavy quilted wool, the kind used in horse blankets. "Building a hope chest for the girl?" Hoek asked. Jonathan didn't look up. "Sleeping box," he said, "for the kinderin." Hoek stared at the cabinet taking shape against the wall. It was the length of a man, the height of a tall child, deep enough that Anna could stretch her arms out without touching the sides. The front was a framework for thick woolen curtains that would hang from an iron rod, sealing the entire opening. It looked, Hoek thought, unsettlingly like the boxes the undertaker stacked outside his barn. He said nothing, but the news traveled faster than frost. By the end of the week, a dozen families had heard about the crazy Hollander building a closet to stuff his children into overnight. The word casket was used more than once and never kindly, but the almanac had not been wrong. On the night of October 15th, the first hard frost arrived without warning. It struck the valley just after midnight, a dry, killing cold that settled over the fields like a sheet of glass. In the morning, the squash vines lay black and limp. The last tomatoes hung frozen on their stakes, perfect red orbs turned to slush. The mercury on Hoke's porch read 28 degrees. It was early even by valley standards, and the old men at the general store grew suddenly quiet. Then, on the evening of the 18th, the temperature fell again, this time to 19. A pig froze in its sty 2 miles east of the Van der Meer claim. Its owner, an Englishman named Teague, found it the next morning stiff as a barrel. Jonathan worked through those nights in the workshop with a lantern burning low. The bedstead was nearly finished now, but he was not satisfied. He added a second layer of wool to the curtain, then a third, stitching each one by hand because the seams had to be tight. He built a low shelf inside the cabinet where a stoneware jug of hot water could rest without tipping, radiating heat for hours. He caulked every joint with linen scraps dipped in beeswax, sealing the wood against drafts. The boys at the river landing said he was wasting time that should have gone into chopping cordwood, and they were half right. A standard winter consumed 4 cords of hardwood for cooking and heating. Jonathan had barely 2 stacked. The rest of his daylight hours had gone into that box. If the bedstead failed, the children would freeze the moment the fire died down, and fires always die down before dawn. His son Johannes understood the risk without being told. The boy had seen his mother buried under frozen ground that wouldn't yield to a shovel without the fire built on top of it first. He remembered the sound of the pickaxe bouncing off the iron-hard dirt, his father sobbing between swings. So when Jonathan asked him to climb inside the bedstead for a test, Johannes did it without hesitation. He crawled in, drew the curtains closed, and lay there in the wool-smelling dark while his father waited outside with his hand on the wood. 5 minutes passed, 10. "Johannes," Jonathan finally asked. The boy's voice came back muffled but clear. "It's warm, Papa, warmer than my bed was last winter." That was the first good sign. The next one came when Anna, who had been fussing with a cold all week, lay inside for an hour and woke dry-cheeked, her breathing easy. The humid warmth inside the box had cleared her small airways like a steam tent. Jonathan allowed himself a breath of relief. It was, as it turned out, the last one he would get for a long time. On October 22nd, the sky turned the color of ash. A mass of polar air was descending from Canada, funneling down the Hudson River corridor, and the valley lay directly in its path. By midday, the temperature had dropped to 6 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind picked up, scattering the last dried leaves in spirals across the fields. The store in the village ran out of coal oil by 3 in the afternoon. Families stuffed rags into their window frames and prayed. Hoke came by the Van der Meer house that evening, his beard already rimed with ice from the short ride. He found Jonathan carrying his sleeping daughter toward the bedstead, while Johannes already lay inside, bundled in fleece. "This is it then," Hoke said. "You're actually going to shut them in there all night." Jonathan laid Anna down on the mattress pad and adjusted the wool cap over her ears. "The curtain stays closed," he said. "I've left a finger's gap at the top for air." Hoke looked at the 2 small faces in the dim lantern light, then at the heavy drapery that would soon seal them into a space barely larger than a coffin. "What if they can't breathe?" he asked, his voice low. "What if the wool shifts and smothers them?" Jonathan pulled the curtain closed. The room went quiet. The only sound was the wind outside and the faint, steady rhythm of 2 children breathing in the dark. The frost deepened as midnight approached. The stove in the main room began to struggle, its heat pulled upward through the chimney and scattered by the drafts around the window frames. Jonathan and Hoke sat on opposite sides of the fire, wrapped in coats, saying little. At one point, Hoke checked his pocket watch. -4 degrees outside and still falling. He could feel the wall behind him radiating cold through the logs. The window glass was white with frost on the inside. Yet when Jonathan pressed his hand flat against the wooden panel of the bedstead, the surface was warm to the touch. Body heat trapped and recirculating. The children slept on. Sometime around 2 in the morning, Hoke rose to tend his horse in the lean-to, then returned with a look of grim news. "Teague's barn just lost its roof," he said. "The beams snapped from the weight of ice." He paused, his breath plumbing. "His youngest is sick, coughing hard. The house is barely above freezing." Jonathan didn't respond. He was staring at the bedstead. The wool curtains had begun to develop a thin, glistening coat of frost along the top hem where the moist air inside had condensed against the cold outer edge. It sparkled faintly in the lantern light. Condensation was normal. What Jonathan hadn't anticipated was how rapidly it would freeze. The gap at the top he'd left for ventilation was narrowing, the wool fibers stiffening into a sheet of ice. By 3 o'clock, a white crust sealed the curtain to the wooden rod above. No air was moving in or out. The children were still breathing inside, but for how much longer? Jonathan stood up, his heart pounding. He pulled at the curtain. It didn't move. He pulled harder, and a shower of ice crystals fell onto the floor, but the fabric held. The box had become a sealed chamber, and somewhere inside it, in the dark, his daughter began to cough. Hoke was on his feet before Jonathan could speak. "Get a knife," he said, but Jonathan was already moving, his hands shaking as he fumbled through the work drawer beside the stove. He found a short-bladed paring knife, the same one he'd used to cut Anna's bread that morning, and returned to the bedstead. The curtain was stiff as a board, a frozen slab of wool and ice. He couldn't rip it without risking the whole panel collapsing inward onto the children. He pressed the blade against the top hem, just beneath the iron rod, and began to saw. Ice squealed against the steel. Hoke held the lantern close, their breath clouding in the air, the cold from the window now so intense that the water in the wash basin had cracked its ceramic bowl. The curtain fibers parted slowly, each thread releasing with a wet snap. Finally, the gap widened enough for Jonathan to force 2 fingers through, and then his whole hand. He yanked the drape to one side. The air that rushed out was warm and wet, smelling of wool and sleep and the faint sweetness of Anna's breath. Both children were alive. Johan sat up, blinking, his face flushed with sleep heat. "Papa, it got hot," he said, as if reporting a fault. Anna was still half asleep, but her cough had stopped the moment the curtain opened. The air exchange had been just enough. Jonathan lifted her out, held her to his chest, and felt her heartbeat steady against his palm. The crisis had passed, but the night was not over. Hoke spent the next 2 hours carving a narrow ventilation slot into the top rail of the bedstead frame, a permanent gap no larger than the width of a man's thumb, shielded by an angled wooden baffle, so the updraft would draw fresh air without letting the warmth escape. Jonathan lined the slot with a strip of oiled cloth that would repel frost before it could form. By the time they finished, the stove had burned low, and the temperature inside the cabin had fallen to 14 degrees. The children were back in the box, the curtain partially open, the baffle doing its job. Jonathan watched the little slot for a long while, saw the faint shimmer of exhaled moisture rising through it, and knew they had just dodged the first bullet. He let himself sit down, his back against the warmest log, and waited for dawn. When morning finally broke, it revealed a valley transformed into a white morgue. Every standing puddle was frozen solid to the bottom. The willow trees along the creek had split their bark in long, ragged cracks. A pair of crows lay dead beneath the churchyard elm, their feet curled into tight black fists. Hoke rode out at first light to check on Teague's place, and returned with news that settled like a stone in Jonathan's stomach. The roof collapse had not been the worst of it. Teague's youngest, a boy of 4 named Samuel, had died in the night. The house had been too cold for a child already weak with congestion. His mother found him blue-lipped in his crib at first light. Teague was outside now, swinging an axe into the frozen woodpile, not stopping, not speaking. By noon, a small crowd had gathered at the general store to discuss the tragedy. Some blamed the cold. Some blamed Teague for not putting more wood by. A few, like Deacon Hoke, stood silent and thought of the Van der Meer children who had slept through the same night in a wooden box and woken up warm. Word of that spread faster than the frost ever had, and the first people who had laughed at Jonathan now began to look at his little cabinet with something entirely different. 2 days later, on October 25th, a second night of killing cold descended. This time, the temperature fell to -11. The Hudson River itself began to freeze along its edges, a thing no living settler had seen that early in the year. In that one night, 3 more households lost children under the age of 5. One of them was the Nieuwendijk family, Dutch-born like Jonathan but far less prepared. They had mocked the bedstead as superstitious nonsense. Their daughter, 4-year-old Lot, had shared a bed with her older sister, piled under every blanket they owned. It hadn't been enough. Hoke came to Jonathan's door that evening, his face gaunt. He didn't preach. He didn't accuse. He simply said, "Marinus Nieuwendyk wants to see you." Jonathan pulled on his coat and followed him out into the frozen dark. The Nieuwendyk house was a mile away, small and huddled against the wind. Inside, the father sat at his table with his head in his hands. His wife lay in the back room, sedated with the last of their Dutch Geneva. The surviving child, a boy of 6, sat beside the cold stove, shivering despite the blanket wrapped around him. Nieuwendyk looked up at Jonathan with eyes that had been weeping and now were just empty. "Tell me how the box works," he said. His voice cracked on the last word. "I need to know for my boy." Jonathan sat down. He did not give a lecture. He simply described the principle. A small enclosed space, body heat trapped and recycled, the curtain acting as a thermal barrier, the wool absorbing moisture without losing its insulating properties, the baffle preventing condensation from sealing the airflow. Nieuwendyk listened without speaking. When Jonathan finished, the man stood up, walked to his woodpile, and began carrying planks into the house. He worked through the night, following Jonathan's instructions as best he could, and by morning, a rough, unpainted bedstead stood against the kitchen wall. His son slept in it that very day, during the coldest hours before dawn, and woke up with warm feet. Nieuwendyk would later say it was the only reason he didn't lose a second child, but he never forgave himself for the first. The thing no one had anticipated was how quickly a desperate community could change its mind. Within a week of Lot's death, 4 more families had approached Jonathan, asking him to build bedsteads for their own children. He had no lumber to spare. He had no time to spare either, but he could not refuse. He took out his remaining kiln-dried pine, the same boards he'd set aside for a new kitchen table, and began cutting them into sleeping boxes. Hoke donated wool from the livery. The women of the church sewed curtains in a single afternoon. Each box took 2 days to build, and by the time the 4th was finished, the valley had seen its first true blizzard of the winter. On November 2nd, the sky opened up and dropped 18 inches of snow in 6 hours. Drifts piled against the north wall of every house in the settlement. The temperature stayed at -15 for 3 straight days. The wind howled down the river corridor, and the old Dutch windmill outside the village seized up for the first time since it was built. Yet in the homes that now had bedsteads, the children slept. They were not merely surviving the cold, they were outlasting it. And then, unexpectedly, a visitor arrived from outside the valley. His name was Dr. Emil van der Weyden, a physician who had trained in Leiden and now lectured at the Albany Medical College. He had heard rumors of a bizarre Dutch practice being revived in the Hudson Valley, rumors that children were being put to bed in cupboards, and he came to see it for himself. He arrived with a medical bag and a skeptical scowl, expecting to find cases of suffocation or damp-induced tuberculosis. What he found instead shook his entire understanding of cold weather survival. Jonathan took Van der Weyden to the Nieuwendyk house first. The physician examined the boy who had survived, checked his lungs, his pulse, his skin tone. The child was healthy, well-rested, with no sign of respiratory distress. Then they visited the Van der Meer home. The doctor crawled into the bedstead himself, asked Jonathan to close the curtain, and remained inside for 20 minutes. When he emerged, his expression had changed. "The temperature inside the box is 51 degrees, he said. "The room outside is 22. That's a differential of nearly 30 degrees. He paused, pulling out a notebook. "This is not folklore, this is engineering." Van der Weyden spent 3 days in the valley, documenting every detail of the bedsteads. He measured the humidity inside the boxes during the night. He recorded the oxygen levels using a chemical apparatus he carried in his case. He interviewed parents, children, and the man who built them. And before he left, he told Jonathan something that would change everything. If the winter continues at this severity, and it will, every family in this region without one of these boxes will lose someone before spring. You're no longer a cabinet maker, Mr. Van der Meer. You've become something else entirely. Jonathan didn't understand what that meant, not yet, but he was about to find out. 2 days later, a delegation from the next settlement over, a town called Pine Plains, arrived with a wagon load of cut pine and a simple request. They had heard about the box beds. They wanted to pay Jonathan to build 20 of them, and they wanted them before the next hard frost cycle arrived, which the almanac said would begin around the start of December. 20 boxes in less than 4 weeks, while the temperature kept dropping and his own children needed his protection. It was an impossible request, and every man in the valley knew it. But Jonathan had just been visited by a physician who'd called him something more than a carpenter, and the memory of Lot Nieuwendake's frozen face still lingered in his mind. He looked at the wood, looked at the expectant faces, and nodded. He would build them, but even he didn't yet know what the true cost would be. The cost announced itself silently. In the number of hours Jonathan no longer slept. The order from Pine Plains required 20 bedsteads, each one fitted with the wool-lined curtain, the stoneware warming shelf, the ventilation baffle that had saved his own children's lives. He calculated the man-hours, and the math refused to bend. Even working from the moment the sun cracked the horizon until the lantern guttered out near midnight, he could complete no more than one box every 2 days. That meant 40 days of labor minimum, and the next hard frost cycle was due in less than 4 weeks. The delegation had left the pine, but it was green, cut too recently, still weeping sap from the ends. Kiln-dried stock would have been stable, predictable. This wood would warp if he worked it too fast, and warped planks meant gaps, and gaps meant death. So Jonathan began the slow, painstaking process of air-drying every plank beside his stove, rotating them every few hours, losing precious minutes that he stole from his own meals and his own rest. Johans helped as much as a 7-year-old could. He swept the shavings, carried the smaller boards, and learned to test a joint for draft by holding a wet finger against the seam. His small hands grew cracked and raw from the cold that seeped through the workshop walls, but he never complained. He had seen the frozen crows, heard his father's description of the Teague boy, and understood with the terrible clarity of children who have already buried one parent that this work was the only thing standing between his little sister and the frost. The first 4 boxes went out to Pine Plains on November 8th, delivered by a farmer named Steen who had lost his own crop to the early freeze and now earned what he could hauling freight. Jonathan sent detailed instructions with each one. The curtain must hang free, the baffle slot must never be covered, the hot water jug must be wrapped in a cloth to prevent burns. He insisted on demonstrating the proper use to each family personally, but the weather turned the day after Steen left, and Jonathan was trapped in his valley while the boxes traveled on without him. That was the mistake that nearly destroyed everything. 3 nights later, a rider galloped into the settlement just after midnight, his horse lathered despite the cold. He carried a message from a man named Coster in Pine Plains, a blacksmith who had purchased one of the bedsteads for his infant son. The child had stopped breathing. The mother had found him limp and blue inside the box. The blacksmith had smashed the curtain rail with his fist, dragged the boy into the open air, and only then had the child gasped and cried. The message was not a thank you for the design. It was an accusation of attempted murder. By morning, every person in the valley had heard. Hoke found Jonathan in the workshop, standing motionless before a half-finished bedstead, his hands hanging at his sides. "What happened?" Hoke asked, but Jonathan already knew before the rider had finished his tale. The Coster family had hung an extra blanket over the curtain rod to keep in more heat, not understanding that the ventilation baffle required an open top edge. They had sealed the box completely. The child's own exhaled breath had displaced the oxygen, and carbon dioxide had risen silently around his small face until his brain began to starve. The box was not defective. The instructions had been ignored. But that distinction would mean nothing if the story spread that a cabinet maker from the Dutch settlement was building coffins disguised as beds. The fallout was swift and brutal. 2 families in the valley who had already received bedsteads demanded that Jonathan remove them from their homes. The pastor of the Reformed Church, a man named DeWitt who had opposed the bedstead from the beginning as unchristian superstition, preached a sermon that Sunday comparing the boxes to the tombs of the Pharisees. The story traveled beyond Pine Plains, beyond the valley, all the way to Albany, where Dr. Van der Weyden heard it from a colleague at the medical college and immediately wrote a letter to Jonathan that arrived 3 days later. "Prove it," the letter said. "Prove the design is sound, or I cannot defend you." Jonathan had no laboratory, no medical journals, no standing in the scientific community. All he had was a half-built box, 2 children who still needed to sleep through the night, and a winter that was growing colder by the hour. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He took apart the Coster box, which Steen had hauled back from Pine Plains at his own expense, and he examined every joint, every seam, every fiber of wool. Then he rebuilt it, adding a second baffle that would pull fresh air from the floor even if the top was fully blocked, a redundant safety that no one had asked for and no one would pay for. He worked alone, with the door of the workshop closed, while outside the temperature dropped again and the settlement held its breath. Then on November 15th, Dr. Van der Weyden arrived unannounced with 2 other physicians from the city, a journalist from the Albany Argus, and a set of chemical instruments so delicate they had been packed in wool-lined cases. He had not come to defend Jonathan. He had come to test the bedstead under controlled conditions, and he intended to publish the results regardless of what they revealed. "If your box kills children, the world will know," he said, not unkindly. "If it saves them, the world must know that too." They set up the experiment in the Van der Meer cabin, using a lamb borrowed from a neighbor as a test subject. The animal was placed inside the bedstead, its vital signs monitored through a small observation port. The temperature outside the box was 13 degrees. Inside, after 1 hour, it was 48. The lamb's respiration remained steady. The oxygen level, measured by Van der Weyden's eudiometer, held constant at 19%, well within safe limits. The ventilation baffle drew exactly as Jonathan had designed. The reporters from the Argus took notes while the physicians murmured among themselves, and by evening the verdict was clear. The bedstead was not merely safe. It was the most effective cold-weather survival tool any of them had ever seen. The article ran in the Argus 3 days later under the headline, "A Dutchman's Box Bed Defies the Frost." Within a week, letters began arriving from settlements as far away as Schenectady, Poughkeepsie, and even a small community in the Catskills where winter had already buried the roads. Every letter carried the same request. They wanted bedsteads. They wanted Jonathan to build them or teach them to build their own. The carpenter who had been mocked as a madman stuffing his children into a drawer was suddenly the most sought-after man in the Hudson Valley. But the winter did not care about newspaper articles. On November 22nd, the temperature fell to -22 degrees, the coldest November day ever recorded in the region. The river froze solid from bank to bank. Livestock died in their stalls. A family of 4 in a town called Gallatin was found frozen to death in their own kitchen, the stove still warm from the last log they'd fed it. The killing frost had not yet reached its peak, but it was coming, and every forecast said the same thing. The first week of December would bring a cold snap that would make everything before it look like an autumn breeze. Jonathan now faced an impossible equation. He could build perhaps 4 more boxes before that cold snap hit, enough for his own family and 3 others. The rest of the valley, the rest of Pine Plains, the rest of every settlement that had written to him, would face the frost unprotected. Unless he taught them. Unless he spent his remaining days not building boxes, but teaching other men to build them, trusting that they would do it right, knowing that any mistake would be laid at his door. He gathered the men of the settlement in the church on the evening of November 25th. They came with saws and hammers, with doubts and fears, and he taught them everything he knew. The baffle design, the wool layering, the curve of the curtain rod that prevented ice from forming. He worked through the night with them, moving from house to house, checking each box as it was completed, making corrections, never raising his voice, never stopping. His own hands bled through the bandages. His eyes burned from the smoke and the cold, But one by one, the bedsteads rose in the small homes of the valley, and the children began to sleep inside them. Then, on the last night of November, the sky turned white, not with snow, but with a pale, translucent haze that old-timers called Breath of the North. The temperature began to plunge. By midnight, it was -31. By 2 in the morning, -38. The wind did not blow. The air was perfectly still, and that was the worst sign of all, because a still sky allowed the heat of the earth to radiate straight up into the void. Nothing moved in that frozen darkness except the faint, steady rise of smoke from a dozen chimneys, and the soft, warm breathing of children inside their wooden boxes. Inside the Van der Meer cabin, Jonathan sat with his back against the bedstead, listening to the soft rhythm of Anna and Johann sleeping behind the curtain. The baffle was open. The stoneware jug was warm. The frost was clawing at the window glass, but inside the box the temperature was 51 degrees. He had done everything he could. Now he could only wait and listen. The stillness outside the cabin was absolute, the kind of silence that made men on the frontier believe they could hear their own blood moving. Jonathan pressed his palm flat against the bedstead panel. It was warm. The children breathed on, slow and steady, two small signatures of life in the long frozen dark. He had not slept in 30 hours. His eyes burned, his hands were cracked and wrapped in strips of linen, but he did not dare close his eyes. The stove needed feeding, the baffle needed checking, and the frost outside was not finished. At 4 in the morning, the temperature reached -41. That number would later be confirmed by a government weather station at Albany, but in the valley, the only gauge was the sound of nails popping from the wall boards as the cold contracted the wood. Jonathan heard it, a sharp little crack, then another like small bones snapping. He stoked the stove, waited for the iron to glow, and listened. Somewhere out in that frozen darkness, families were huddled around their own fires, watching their children sleep inside wooden boxes he had designed or taught others to build. The thought was not comforting. It was crushing. If even one bedstead failed tonight, if even one baffle iced over or one curtain came loose, the weight of that would live inside him forever. Dawn came not as light but as a slow dilution of the dark, the sky shifting from black to a pale, milky gray that revealed the shape of the world. The frost had painted everything white, but it was not snow. It was rime ice, thick and granular, clinging to every surface like a fungus. The well bucket was frozen solid to the rope. The goat shed door would not open until Jonathan poured boiling water over the hinges. The cold had a physical presence, a weight that pressed against the chest and made breathing an effort. Yet inside the bedstead, Anna stirred and called for water, and her voice was strong. Johans climbed out on his own, his cheeks flushed pink, and the boy's first words were not of fear but of hunger. The box had held. Hoke rode over just after sunrise, his horse moving through the bitter air with frost caked on its muzzle. He had circled the settlement since first light, knocking on doors, pulling back curtains. What he reported was a miracle no one would have believed 2 months earlier. Of the 11 children sleeping in bedsteads across the valley that night, every single one had survived. Warmth, measured roughly by hand, ranged from 48 to 53 degrees inside the boxes, while the rooms around them had fallen into the low teens. In one house, the water in a pitcher had frozen solid 3 feet from the bedstead, but the child inside was sweating lightly under a single wool blanket. The design had not been flawless. 2 families reported the curtains freezing at the edges, the same problem Jonathan had confronted weeks earlier, but the redundant baffles had done their job. Air had moved. Oxygen had held. Children had lived, but the valley had not escaped unharmed. In the houses without bedsteads, the cold had taken what it always took. An elderly woman named Moes, who had refused to leave her bed beside the drafty window, had died in her sleep. A family of 5 in a converted barn on the north end of the valley had lost their infant, a girl of 3 months, despite burning every stick of furniture they owned. The father had broken apart a wooden chest, a table, 2 chairs, and still the cold had won. When Hoke described it, his voice broke. He had found the man outside in the frozen yard, holding his daughter, trying to warm her against his own chest, long after it was already too late. Jonathan listened, and then he began to work. The grief in the valley was real, but so was the demand. The families who had survived without bedsteads now wanted them. The families who had mocked the idea now begged for it. The pastor DeWitt, the same man who had compared the boxes to tombs, arrived at the workshop before noon, his pride frozen harder than the ground. He did not apologize, but he did not need to. He simply said, "My grandchildren need a box. I will pay whatever you ask." Jonathan looked at him for a long moment, then handed him a saw. "Help me cut," he said. "That's the price." The workshop became a factory that week. Not a factory of machines and assembly lines, but of men. Jonathan could not build fast enough alone, so he organized the labor into stations. Hoke cut planks. Steen, the hauler, delivered pine from Pine Plains. 3 farmers who had lost their crops and had nothing else to do shaped joints and stitched curtains under the direction of the women from the church. The workshop rang with the sound of hammers and saws from first light until long after dark. Johans moved through the chaos carrying nails and water, a small boy in the middle of an industry that had not existed a month earlier. Anna watched from a blanket near the stove, her cold now entirely gone, her eyes bright as she played with wood shavings. The story in the Albany Argus had lit a fuse. Letters poured in. By the second week of December, Jonathan had received requests from over 40 families across 3 counties. He could not fulfill them all. He could barely fulfill a tenth of them. So he did what the original Dutch settlers had done centuries earlier. He made the design public. He drew up plans, simple sketches with measurements and notes, and sent them back with every letter. He wrote instructions in careful script, describing exactly how to angle the baffle, how many layers of wool to use, how to test the seal with a candle flame. He gave away the secret, and in doing so he gave away his monopoly, but it didn't matter. The winter was too long and too cruel for one man to fight alone. By Christmas, there were bedsteads in 30 homes across the Hudson Valley. By New Year's Day, the number had crossed 50. Each one was slightly different, modified by the families who built them, adapted to the size of their houses and the shape of their rooms, but all followed the same core principle. A small enclosed space, warmed by body heat, ventilated by a baffled slot, sealed by a heavy curtain of wool. The design was no longer Jonathan's alone. It belonged to the valley and to the winter. The killing frost finally broke in the 3rd week of January, when a warm front from the south pushed the polar air back toward Canada. The temperature rose to 40 degrees in a single afternoon, and the valley exhaled. Snow melted in great sheets, revealing the ground beneath, brown and dead and beautiful. The river cracked and began to flow. People emerged from their houses blinking, like survivors of a siege, and took stock of what they had lost: livestock, crops, property, and what they had not lost: children, dozens of them. The statistical reality was stark. In the settlements without bedsteads, the infant mortality rate that winter had been nearly 4 times higher than in the valley. Dr. Van der Weyden would later publish a paper in the New York Medical Journal documenting the results, with a title that read, "The Bedstead as a Public Health Intervention, Observations from the Hudson Valley Frost of 1887-88. It was dry, academic language, but the conclusion was anything but. The box bed had saved lives. The data proved it. And then came the twist, the thing no one in the valley had predicted. When spring arrived and the frost was finally gone, the demand for bedsteads did not disappear with the cold. Families who had survived the winter wanted them for the next one. Families who had not built them wanted them for their future children. The design had moved beyond survival into something else entirely: culture. The bedstead became a standard piece of furniture in the Dutch settlements, a mark of preparedness, of wisdom, of a lesson learned in blood. And the man who had introduced it, the cabinet maker Jonathan Van der Meer, spent the rest of that winter and the entirety of the next doing only one thing. He did not build tables or chairs or hope chests or kitchen cabinets. He built bedsteads, nothing else. The carpenter who had been laughed at, the fool stuffing his children in a drawer, had become the most important craftsman in the valley. His workshop never fell silent. His hands never stopped. And every box he built carried the same small detail: A double baffle, one at the top and one at the bottom, the redundant safety that had been born from a near tragedy in Pine Plains. He never removed it, even in the mildest winters, because he had learned what the frost had taught him. The design was not just for the worst nights. It was for every night, because the cold never truly goes away. It waits. And in the Hudson Valley, every family now knew that when it returned, their children would sleep inside wooden boxes, warm and breathing, while the wind howled outside and found no purchase. One final detail, a surprising one, would not emerge until many years later. In 1902, a historian of Dutch-American folkways traveled through the valley documenting traditional practices. She found that the bedstead had spread far beyond the original settlements, adopted by English, German, and Scandinavian families alike. And in almost every home she visited, the families referred to the box bed not by its Dutch name, but by the name of the man who had revived it. They called it a Van der Meer bed. The name had outlasted the mockery, outlasted the frost, outlasted everything. And the children who had once been stuffed into a drawer were now grown men and women, with children of their own, sleeping safe in the same wooden boxes their grandfather had built for them. The story of Jonathan Van der Meer begins with ridicule and ends with a piece of furniture. But what sits between those 2 points is something far larger. It's the story of how a small, forgotten piece of Dutch folk wisdom crossed an ocean, survived the mockery of neighbors, and proved itself against a winter that killed the unprepared. The bedstead was never a revolutionary invention. It was a box and a curtain and a careful understanding of how warm air behaves, nothing more. And yet, in the winter of 1887, that simple combination mattered more than wealth, more than strength, more than any amount of brute force firewood. It mattered because Jonathan understood something that the modern mind often forgets. The answers to our most dangerous problems are sometimes not new ideas at all. They are old ideas, waiting in the attic of history, ignored until the moment we need them so badly that we can no longer afford to laugh. Across the world, in almost every cold weather culture, variations of the enclosed sleeping space have appeared. Inuit igloos trap body heat in a small, insulated chamber. Scottish box beds, nearly identical to the bedstead, survived in the highlands for centuries. Japanese kotatsu frames capture warmth under a heavy quilt. All of them rely on the same physics. A human body is a furnace, and a small space, properly sealed, can turn that furnace into a life support system. Jonathan Van der Meer didn't discover that principle. He just remembered it when everyone else had forgotten, and he trusted it when everyone else was calling him a fool. There's a line in the old Dutch records about the bedstead that says, simply, "The cupboard bed keeps the sleepers safe from the night vapors." For centuries, people believed that the danger of the cold was not the temperature itself, but something in the air, a miasma that seeped into the lungs. They weren't entirely wrong. The danger was the cold, and the cold came with the air. Sealing a small space against it, allowing only enough ventilation to breathe, turned out to be one of the smartest things a family could do on a frozen night. The science is straightforward, but it took a winter of death to make anyone listen. The question that lingers after the frost melts and the crops are replanted is this: was Jonathan Van der Meer brilliant, or was he simply willing to trust something that his grandmother could have told him in a single sentence? The neighbors who mocked him were not stupid. They were practical people who had survived winters with large fires and heavy blankets, and they assumed that more of the same would always be enough. But a killing frost doesn't respond to more. It responds to different. And the difference was a box of still air, built by a man who had once been helpless beside his dying wife's bed, and who refused to be helpless again. Subscribe now to witness more stories where forgotten wisdom meets impossible odds, where ordinary people change the rules of survival, and where the line between madness and salvation turns out to be thinner than a woolen curtain. Thank you for watching.